The next speaker is Dr. Calum MacKellar. He is Director of Research of the Scottish Council on Human Bioethics, which is a registered Scottish charity engaging with biomedical ethics in Scotland. He speaks about the ethical perspective of heritable genome editing. Calum, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank also the people organizing this very interesting seminar. Okay, so what I'll be presenting now is just one argument that I believe is important, but there's other arguments that are also really interesting relating to this whole debate on heritable genome editing. And I'd like to just begin by asking this question: can certain gene manipulation procedures be considered as therapy? But before doing this, it is necessary to examine different kinds of personal identities. And though there is no consensus in literature, it is possible to differentiate between, first of all, numerical identity, and this examines whether two distinct individuals exist, enabling them to be numbered, for example, individual number 1 and individual number 2. And also there's what we call qualitative identity. This examines similarities in properties between the same individual at different settings, such as 2 different times, or between distinct individuals. For example, identical twins are qualitatively identical for the most part, but numerically distinct. Each twin exists in a different setting of the 3 dimensions of space. In this context, each numerically distinct individual also has a specific and unique life, a sort of life trajectory. This begins and ends at a particular 3-dimensional place and at a certain time, from creation of the life to death. Therefore, the beginning of a specific life trajectory, of a specific life, is especially important for the rest of the life of a specific biological being. So what does all this mean in the specific context of heritable genome editing? How can we consider genetic modifications which take place either on the sperm or egg cell before conception or during fertilization? Well, a new individual who would not otherwise have existed without the genetic modification is being brought into existence. A totally new individual with a totally new life trajectory is being created. For example, if the X chromosome in a sperm cell that is used to fertilize an egg to give a 1-cell embryo containing XX chromosomes is exchanged for a Y chromosome, what do we get? Well, the individual eventually resulting from this substitution would have a completely different life to the one who would otherwise have existed. Indeed, the resulting boy with XY chromosomes in all his cells would have a completely different life, a different life trajectory to the one of the girl with XX chromosomes in all her cells. So this new boy would exist instead of the girl. And by this argument, one and only one individual with a particular life is considered to arise from a particular biological setting, such as genes in a genome at creation of this life. So to conclude, in making a genetic modification to a person who already exists, and we've called this therapeutic somatic gene therapy, we are just changing the qualitative identity. We're making a person better. We're using, for example, biomedical treatment. But the same individual continues his or her existence. However, in making a genetic modification to the sperm and egg before fertilization or during fertilization, and that's what we have with heritable genome editing, a new person with a different numerical identity to the one who would have been created is being brought into existence. In a way, we have a totally new life with a totally new life trajectory. Thus, it is important to note that heritable genome editing procedures are not therapeutic. And this is a point that was made by Marcy right at the beginning. They cannot be considered as a form of medical or clinical treatment, even though you hear this so many times, even in serious newspapers. They only bring, so heritable genome editing only brings into existence certain kinds of individuals. So what is ethically wrong with heritable genome editing? Well, with heritable genome editing, a new individual is being brought into existence in preference to another individual because he or she has biological qualities which are seen as more desirable. Therefore, it is clearly a form of selection. But we can then ask the question, how is this selection made? On what basis is the decision made to only create certain kinds of people? Well, this decision by individuals to select can only be made by looking around themselves. In other words, this decision to select can only be based on a person's perception of actually existing individuals around them and whether some lives are seen as more desirable than others who may, for example, have a disability. Indeed, as Professor Hans Reinders explains, I think he's professor at the Free University of Amsterdam, it is more likely that in any given case, the only reasonable answer to the question of why a disabled child should not be born is by reference to what one thinks about the lives of people living with the same disorder. In other words, the decision to select or deselect reveals a person's moral worldview, a discriminatory view, I believe, which they would not usually want to share with others. Moreover, the decision to select or deselect a possible future person on the basis, for example, of disability, indirectly sends a message. It gives a message to persons who have already been born with the same disability, that it would have been preferable if they had not even been born. Therefore, the decision to select implies that the value of all possible human beings is simply based on their biological qualities, not on their absolute and inherent equal worth. And this can clearly be considered as a form of discrimination and an undermining of the inherent equality of all human beings in society. This means that any form of selection through heritable genome editing cannot be accepted since it has a clear eugenic element. Indeed, any basis for such selection would generally be considered to be as discriminatory as on any other basis, for example, based on sex. And in the UK and in most of Europe, it is illegal to select for sex. Why? Because sex, male and female, is considered to be absolutely equal. A man and a woman is considered to be absolutely equal in value and worth. So you cannot select for sex. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that society is now before a crossroads with heritable genome editing selection procedures. It can either choose to make sure that certain persons are not brought into existence because their lives are considered as less desirable. But this would then mean that society would no longer believe in equality. And indeed, it would be prepared to classify the worth of all lives, of you and me, and start going down the eugenic road. Or society can choose to believe that all lives are equal in value and in worth, which is the very basis of a civilized society. This would then mean that any selection becomes meaningless. And this would mean also prohibiting heritable genome editing. And this is why in a number of international texts like the UNESCO's 1997 Universal Declaration on Human Rights and Human Genome and Human Rights, it indicates in Article 24 that heritable genome editing interventions could be considered as a practice that will be contrary to human dignity, sorry. And then we saw as well at the beginning, Marcy already mentioned this, the European Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, which indicates in Article 13 that interventions on the human genome are prohibited if its principal aim is to introduce any modifications in the genome of any descendants. And one of the reasons such texts reject heritable genome modifications was because unacceptable discrimination is inevitably associated to selection strategies of human persons. And I was at the Council of Europe, actually Roberto Andorra was there as well some years ago, when the UK delegation was trying to argue that this Article 13 of the European Convention we should get rid of it in a way, because the debate, it wasn't really about eugenics. But the UK delegation was trying something that I believe they had no basis to do, because amongst all the persons who wrote this convention, there were certainly some who were arguing that there is an aspect of eugenics behind heritable genome editing. So selection strategies which have a clear genetic intent, like heritable genome editing, I believe undermine the very basis of equality between all existing and possible future persons. This argument is not always easy, but my council has just put together a very short cartoon that lasts actually 2 minutes on YouTube. And if you want to see it, please go to YouTube and put in, is heritable genome editing compatible with equality in an inclusive society? Thank you very much.